It's Donald Trump's first big foreign trip. It is to the Middle East. He may or may not be getting a plane out of it, or America may or may not be getting a plane out of it, a gift from the Qatari royal family. But there are wider business deals as well, and wider deals in the business of politics. He is setting out what seems to be a new approach to the Middle East and potentially a new approach to the world. Welcome to Americast.
Americast from BBC News.
Hello, it's Sarah here, and I'm in Doha in Qatar.
And it's Anthony. I'm also in Doha, in the same hotel, probably just a few floors down from you.
And it's Justin, looking on enviously from the worldwide headquarters of Americast in London, England. And I should start us off by saying it is, 3:15 in the afternoon here in London on Wednesday, the 14th of May. And it's particularly important this week because the president is moving at what I think we can honestly say is a pretty whirlwind pace through the Gulf countries. But with Anthony and Sarah either in tow or in advance, so not a single second of anything that he does and says is going to be missed. Should we kick off with the Doha stuff, policy-wise, just before we go back to Saudi Arabia, as it were, because both are important. Doha, Anthony, so Qatar, and we discussed this a bit when we were talking about the gift of the plane on the last pod. There are significant people, aren't there, on the right in American politics who are upset at what appears to be this burgeoning relationship between Donald Trump and the Qatari royal family who run the show because of how they perceive the state of Qatar.
Yeah, people like Ben Shapiro and Laura Loomer, who are very prominent voices on kind of the new, very online right. They have been critical of Donald Trump's willingness to accept a gift from Qatar, which they associate with too close ties to Hamas and other forces that they view as jihadist here in the Middle East. And even the Senate Majority Leader has criticized Donald Trump, the Republican Senate Majority Leader, so John Thune. And so there are signs that this is a bridge too far for a lot of Donald Trump's supporters, that taking this plane or trying to take this plane raises too many questions about what Qatar is getting in exchange.
And it's not just the gift of the plane, though, is it? It's the fact that Donald Trump is creating new relationships with these Gulf states. I mean, he is, I think, the first American president ever, actually, to officially meet with the Emir of Qatar. I was watching them just sitting down to their meeting earlier, and that was what he said. It's been a long, long time since an American president has been building these, not just relationships, but genuine friendships with Gulf leaders, like he is with the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and like the Qatari Emir. He goes around talking about how long he's known these men for, how close their friendships and relationships are. Now, a lot of that is about business, of course. It's about inward investment to America. It's about striking commercial deals. But it's a very different way of dealing with the Middle East than we have seen more recently. And actually, we heard that in Donald Trump's speech that he made last night. He was saying for all the interventions that there have been from all these kind of from both liberals and conservatives, different American regimes have come into the Middle East and tried to remake it the way they think it ought to be and bring democracy. Donald Trump says it's economic development that's going to get rid of the violence and the chaos of the past. That's what's going to bring the Middle East into the world in a prosperous way, and that is actually the only way forward.
Yeah, it's a very optimistic view of the future of the Middle East that he was giving at the same time that they were clearing out the rubble in Gaza of a hospital that had been bombed by the Israelis. But he just kind of breezed over what's going on in Gaza. He does seem much more focused on these wealthy Gulf states, and he seems to legitimately admire these very wealthy leaders and the power that they command and the pageantry and the pomp and ceremony that they can command. He was in a palace here in Doha earlier today, and he was commenting about the marble and the finish of the marble and saying, I'm in construction. I understand how expensive this is and how well done the craftsmanship in this building. And if you look around here in Doha and throughout the Middle East in these big new Gulf cities, all it is shining towers, these massive skyscrapers that have been built with oil money.
Yeah, between that and the gilded decorations everywhere, he looks quite envious, I think, actually, of the life of a Middle Eastern royal.
Yes, yeah, and the fact that you don't have pesky free presses and all the rest of it, and there's a whole side to Donald Trump, isn't there? Which, let's face it, we've discussed before, but there is a side to Donald Trump that absolutely likes the way that these monarchies are run. And could see himself, if not running America in the same way, see certain aspects of it. We should say, when it comes to the plane, he was pretty vigorous in his defense of that and of the gift. Let's just listen.
So they said to me, we would like to, in effect, we would like to make a gift. You've done so many things, and we'd like to make a gift to the Defense Department, which is where it's going. And I said, well, that's nice. Now, some people say, oh, you shouldn't accept gifts for the country. My attitude is, why wouldn't I accept the gift? We're giving to everybody else. Why wouldn't I accept the gift? Because it's going to be a couple of years, I think, before the Boeings are finished. And they'll be wonderful when they're finished.
Yeah, so we've got a listener question on this. It comes from David. Here it is.
Hello, Americast. My name's David, currently listening on a beach in not so sunny Mauritius. I have a question about the Qatari gift of the winged palace to the US president. As the gift is to the US Department of Defense, why would they be giving it to Trump's library at the end of his term instead of keeping it for use for future presidents?
That's a very good question. It is a gift to the United States. They're framing it in order to get around these gift laws and the constitutional restrictions on presidents accepting foreign gifts is technically to the United States, or would be to the United States of America. I guess the reason why they want to give it to the Trump library is because at that point they will have built the 747 by Boeing that was specifically designed to be the new Air Force One, and so they wouldn't need it anymore. And quite possibly Donald Trump just wants to keep it close by. He says he's not going to fly it after he's president, but in theory, I guess they could put it by his museum and library and make it a tourist attraction for them there. But all of this feels like Donald Trump just really admires this lavish plane. Feels like the current 747 he rides around in is a little too rinky-dinky, and he wants an upgrade.
Just before we leave Qatar and go back, as it were, to Saudi Arabia and pick up on what Sarah was saying about the speech that he made there, because I think it was a really important speech, really interesting speech. Just on the Qatar side of things, though, so he's getting the plane and he's gone there, and it's great for the Qataris and all the rest of it. I mean, it's a state of about 300,000 people, so it's a tiny place with a load of people brought in to do most of the work. What is it, given that it's position with regard to all the negotiations that have been taking place with Hamas to try to get the remaining living hostages out of Gaza, and given what many Americans would say is the over closeness of Qatar to Hamas, is there anything happening behind the scenes? Is there a sort of possibility that something comes of this that does have a direct impact on Gaza? Are we saying that that's a possibility at least, Anthony, or not?
That's a possibility. Israeli negotiators arrived here on Tuesday, and they've been meeting through Qatari intermediaries with Hamas to try to negotiate a new ceasefire. The Americans are participating in that as well. And that actually highlights a key role that Qatar has played on multiple occasions. They were also the intermediary negotiating between the Americans and the Taliban in Afghanistan in 2020 over the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. So they have kind of positioned themselves as the Switzerland, the fair dealers in a lot of different Middle Eastern negotiations, and I think they relish that role. And there may be a breakthrough. Hope springs eternal that they could find some grounds for a new ceasefire in Gaza. And I do think that the Qataris are really enjoying this presidential visit and the attention that Donald Trump is bringing to them. There are American and Qatari flags all up and down the boulevards here. Sarah, I think you said they were also in Saudi Arabia. And there's a building just across the way here that alternates between a big American flag lit up the entire skyscraper and a Qatari flag. So, this is their moment in the sun. And I think this gives them more standing and more gravitas, more influence in the region as they play up their American ties.
Yeah, there are plenty of moments in the sun, don't they? Too many moments in the sun in those parts of the world. Too many for you, Anthony. You got to stay inside. I'm worried for you, even with your Texan heritage.
Felt like home.
Is there anything more, Sarah, we ought to say about Qatar before we move back to Saudi?
Only what's almost certainly a complete coincidence. Did you know that the Trump Organization are building a golf course and a luxury villa complex here in Qatar in
way.
a deal that was announced just a few weeks ago? I mean, the serendipity of that is astonishing, isn't it?
I tell you what, I don't know this for a fact because I haven't checked it, but I very much doubt that two nations, each in possession of a Trump Tower, have ever gone to war. But anyway, okay, let's go back to Saudi, Sarah, because you mentioned that speech right at the beginning. I thought it was a really interesting speech, actually. And it's really tempting always with Donald Trump to just focus on the planes and the alleged corruption and, just all the fuss and the mess and the maelstrom. But actually, sometimes it seems to me he says things in a very, very direct, undiplomatic way that are quite important, whether or not you agree with them. And that speech set out, for me, a kind of real Trump vision of the world and of America's part in that world, and specifically that critique of all those neocons and all the other recent Americans, including on the liberal left, who've wanted either to intervene in the world and make it better, in inverted commas, or have genuinely thought that they could kind of compete and force people to be better, and if necessary, do it by military might. And he is out of that business.
Yeah, and it was actually, I thought, a more eloquent and a more fleshed out statement of that vision than we had heard from him for a very, very long time. Because, I mean, we've never been in any doubt that he doesn't want to get involved in conflicts, that he totally rejects that neocon idea of putting boots on the ground in other countries in order to persuade them to behave more like Americans or introduce democracy. We knew that he's not interested in that. But he brought it all together in a way which was not just a critique of what's gone before and how it had failed, interventions from both the left and the right in America, and explaining why he wanted to withdraw from America's role as the world's policeman, really, but also laying out his own vision, optimistic, as you say, Justin, and possibly not realistic, you might say, Anthony, but nonetheless a vision that he can explain, where he says that basically economic prosperity is what's going to drive the Middle East together. Once these countries are in an economic position to be able to do deals with each other, once you see commercial and trade ties going between them, then there will no longer be any interest in any conflict. Now, I mean, a lot of people would argue you have a very, very long way to go before you could get to that position in the Middle East. But at least he gave us a vision of his philosophy. And it's quite rare to hear one like that from him.
And I think it's something that you would hear from the Biden people as well. Maybe not the attack on interventionism during the George W. Bush years, although I think they have their doubts about that as well. But talking about how there needs to be closer ties in the region, that they need to get beyond the old conflicts and be able to fashion a new future based on trade and co-development. The problem, I think, which is something the Biden people admitted and tried to address, and what Donald Trump seems to skirt over, is the Palestinian question at the heart of this. There are many people here in the region and many people back in the United States who don't think that anything can be done, any kind of progress can be made until that wound is somehow resolved. And I think if you even talk to the Saudis, they are not interested, or have said in the past they're not interested in recognizing Israel and signing on to the Abraham Accords that Donald Trump struck between some of these Gulf states and Israel at the end of his first term, until there is some sort of self-governing in Palestine. And Trump doesn't seem to think that. And in that speech that you mentioned, he really kind of just brushed over Gaza and the situation there, and then focused more on development elsewhere in the Middle East.
Yeah, and there was a moment, wasn't there, where he said, I'd like to see Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords. In other words, recognizing Israel, exactly as you say, Anthony. And I mean, from my I wasn't watching it that closely, but there didn't seem to me to be much of a kind of flutter of applause when that line dropped. In other words, the Saudis are still withholding judgment, I suppose it's fair to say, to put it mildly, on whether they are going to go the whole hog down the road that Trump wants them to go down.
There was a lot of applause, and Trump acknowledges probably the most applause when Donald Trump said that the United States was going to lift the sanctions on Syria and allow investment into Syria now that there's a new president and a new regime there. And that is something that Saudi Arabia and a number of these other Gulf states have been very keen on because while they aren't happy that the Gaza situation isn't resolved, they do seem willing to start opening the spigots of investment into Syria, which desperately needs it after decades of war.
On the Gaza question, though, it's absolutely fascinating the way in which I think Donald Trump is getting away with not saying very much about it. He had a line, Anthony, last night, didn't he, say the people of Gaza deserve a better future. But that was about all I've heard him say, talking about it on this trip, when he's visiting all of these different states who, are deeply invested in a future Palestinian state. They care very, very deeply about that. And Donald Trump is not using any of his diplomatic weight to pressure Israel on that. And yet, despite that, they're able to kind of gloss over it, not mention it, and go on with doing these deals and having these incredibly friendly meetings, even though there's what, could have been a running sore in the middle of this relationship that somehow they're able to ignore.
He made another passing reference to it this morning. He's talked about wanting to ensure the future safety and dignity of the Palestinian people. Said that can't happen as long as Hamas is running Gaza. He said that they took delight in murdering and raping people, and then he moved on to other topics. He spent a lot more time, actually, in this morning's remarks, bashing Joe Biden, saying he was incompetent and not in control, and also claiming that the 2020 election was rigged against him, and touting his victory in 2024 and all of the states, the swing states he won, and how the entire map was Republican red. So, a lot of that was kind of familiar, but it was a little bit jarring to hear him bashing the previous administration while sitting in a room with leaders of all of these different Gulf states.
Yeah, what you do wonder. I mean, those people who do well with Donald Trump are those who are able to kind of deal with him, aren't you? And you look in very different contexts at Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister's efforts to kind of ride the tiger, as it were, and you look at the different approaches taken by Macron in the past, of France, President Macron, and you look across the world at Putin and at Xi Jinping as well, looking at all of this, looking at these speeches, thinking, my goodness, is this a person that I can do some business with? Is this a person that I can get the better of? As well, because they're all going to be thinking that. I mean, I just wonder, from the Israeli perspective, we talked a bit about the Palestinians. From the Israeli perspective, if he is now talking about the new Syrian president, this guy al-Shara, and calling him attractive and tough, given that Israel has quite recently been bombing bits of Syria and is worried about the new Syrian government, is this trip going to go down with Benjamin Netanyahu well or badly?
I think there are already concerns among the Israelis about this trip and about the fact that Donald Trump skipped over Israel and didn't stop, even though there were reports of Israeli officials lobbying the Trump administration right up until almost the day he left to try to add a stop in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem to the trip. And Donald Trump said, no, we'll do that another time. But I think they feel like maybe they've been sidelined a bit. The negotiations over the hostage release, the last American hostage, in Gaza, those were conducted without Israel's participation. The deal that Donald Trump struck with the Houthis to stop their attacking of American shipping in the Red Sea, that didn't include stopping attacks on Israeli shipping or attacks on Israel itself. So I think all of this kind of contributes to a growing concern that maybe the United States and Donald Trump is being wooed a little bit more by these Gulf states, and that's where his attention is.
Can I run up an idea past you both, a kind of a wider idea, which is that, going back to that speech, but also the whole trip, what we're seeing now is a Donald Trump vision of the world, which isn't quite the vision that he had in his first his first term. So in his first term, and that there was a national security document. All presidents, don't they, have this sort of national security strategy that they publish when they come to power. And I remember his in 2017, I suppose it would have been, was very much along the lines of we need to compete with the other big powers in the world, and we need essentially to defeat them or do better than them. And it just seems to me now, I wonder whether what we're beginning to see is a subtly different strategy, which is that we're not trying to defeat them, these other power blocks, and I'm thinking particularly of Saudi and the Gulf states as one of those power blocks. What we're trying to do is say to them, you just stick to your own spheres of influence and we won't get involved. And obviously that's the case with Russia as well, and potentially China. In other words, you've got a kind of sort of, if you think back to 19th century Europe, don't know how much European history you ever did, Anthony, though I suspect you probably know more about it than I do. But if you look back to the kind of concert of powers, the way in which Europe was divided up between spheres of influence, but crucially, they weren't really competing with each other. In fact, they were expressly not competing with each other. And that's the way that Trump sees the world, that people can get on and do their own thing. And America is not necessarily always trying to get the better of them.
This came up when we were talking about Canada last month or the month before, when all of the story was Donald Trump rattling his sabers and talking about annexing Canada. And that is that there are people around Donald Trump who do view that kind of a multipolar, everyone stick to their own region kind of a view of the world. Marco Rubio himself has said that this is no longer a world where the United States is the one big power, but we have to learn how to exist in a world where there are competing large powers and a focus, a fixation on your geographic proximity. That means Canada, Greenland, Panama, everything that we've seen Donald Trump talk about over the past 4 months. All of that fits into that kind of worldview. Now, whether Donald Trump has that explicitly, that's in his head, that we're going to start kind of paying attention to Fortress America surrounded by oceans and let Europeans and Asian nations deal with the stuff in their own backyard, I don't know. But there are people thinkers, international strategists within Donald Trump's orbit who definitely see the world that way.
Yeah, and it's this very 19th century view, isn't it, that your backyard is literally the place is physically closest to you, and seems to be why he offers some sympathy to Vladimir Putin and his view that NATO was encroaching upon Russia's territory and getting too close, and that was what provoked him to invade Ukraine, and one of the reasons why Donald Trump seemed to have sympathy with Vladimir Putin wanting to keep Crimea. And if you look around the rest of the world, you can see America under Donald Trump withdrawing from other places where it maintained influence, trying to counterbalance, say, for instance, China. Great withdrawal from Africa, where the US had a lot of soft power interests in all sorts of different African countries, places where China was also investing a lot of money. And all of that is being withdrawn, partly because USAID has been closed down and there isn't so much overseas aid, but also just in terms of investment and engagement as well. If it is far overseas, America's withdrawing from it. And as Anthony says, creating much more of an idea of a fortress America where its own interests are what surround it without tentacles reaching out around the globe.
That's it for this episode of Americast. You can find all our previous episodes on BBC Sounds. See you all later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.